They came in spring, just when the tulips had begun to open like little mouths gasping for sun. There were 3 of them, 2 in pale blue polos with clipboards and khakis, and one in a suit that didn't quite fit, the shoulders too tight for a man who sat in meetings all day. I had dirt under my fingernails and a trowel in my hand, kneeling next to the creeping thyme I had planted between the stepping stones. I looked up, squinting against the light. "Ma'am," one of them said, with a voice dipped in artificial honey, "we'd like to talk to you about your garden." My garden. That word meant something to me. It meant the space I'd built with my own hands, seed by seed, season by season. It meant the patch of earth where I talked to the worms and laughed at the bees and whispered to the seedlings. It meant mornings barefoot in dew, the joy of a first bloom, the ache of weeding after rain, the smell of basil on my skin. So I smiled, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Sure. What about it?" The one in the too tight suit stepped forward. "We've received several complaints. Your yard is in violation of Municipal Code 18.4.2 regarding landscaping standards and property aesthetics." I stared at him, the words sinking slowly like cold water through cotton. "Complaints?" "Yes," he said. "Several neighbors have raised concerns about the overgrowth, the presence of pollinators in high numbers, and what they described as a general lack of organization." I almost laughed. Lack of organization. I had planned every curve of this garden, every cluster of color. I had built layers like a symphony, early spring bulbs, mid-season perennials, trailing vines, seed-heavy grasses. The bees weren't a problem. They were guests, welcomed with open blooms. But "It's a garden," I said, standing now, brushing soil from my knees. "A real one. It's meant to be wild. That's how nature works." The clipboard woman made a note. The other one opened a folder and handed me a printed sheet. "This is a list of approved plants and acceptable layouts. Lawns should not exceed 4 inches in height. All plantings must be contained within defined borders. No vegetation is to encroach onto sidewalks or neighboring properties. And all landscaping must maintain aesthetic cohesion with the surrounding properties." I read it once, then again. The words were so clean, so sterile. I could almost smell the chlorine between the lines. "There's milkweed in your yard," the woman added, almost apologetically. "That attracts monarchs, yes, but it also attracts aphids. Some residents are worried about pests." "The roses are climbing past regulation height," the man chimed in. "And your compost bins. Technically, they're not permitted within 10 feet of the property line." I looked past them, to the archway of climbing beans, now casting soft green shade over the rosemary. I looked at the corner where I'd left a patch of wild violets for the bumblebees. I thought about the 5-year-old girl down the street who visited every weekend to search for ladybugs. I thought about how I had healed here, after the divorce, after the loneliness, after the grief of losing my mother. And now, they wanted to cut it all back. Flatten it, box it. They didn't care that my sunflowers turned with the sun, golden faces tracking joy. They didn't care that I had planted for the butterflies, for the birds, for the earth itself. All they saw was non-compliance, disorder. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You want me to destroy it? We'll give you 2 weeks to bring it into compliance," the man said. "If not, the city will take action to correct the violations." "Correct the violations," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. I signed nothing. They left and their shadows lingered on the lawn longer than their feet did. I spent the next 14 days in limbo. I tried to reason with them, sent emails, showed diagrams, provided articles about native planting and pollinator habitats. I even gave them a copy of my garden plan, labeled in Latin and English. I reminded them that ecosystems don't bloom in straight lines. I pleaded, but bureaucracy has no ears. On the 15th day, they came with gloves and trimmers and gas-powered, things that roared like angry monsters. They started with the sunflowers. Big, thick stalks that had stood like sentries, chopped, laid flat on the earth like felled trees. The lavender went next, the bees swarming in confusion as the blossoms were stuffed into black garbage bags. My basil, my mint, my rows of heirloom tomatoes, torn up like weeds. I watched from my porch, unmoving, as the last of my zinnias were stomped into the dirt. I didn't cry until they pulled up the milkweed. That felt like betrayal. My mother used to say milkweed was a promise that butterflies would return. Now, even the promise was gone. When they left silence behind them. Not the peace of evening hush or morning dew, but a dead quiet. No buzz of wings, no scent of flowers, no rustle of life. Just trimmed grass, a few sad shrubs, and a dull ache in my chest. That night, I sat alone in the dark, a cup of tea gone, cold in my hands. I looked out the window at the ghost of what had been. My fingers still itched for the soil. My heart still heard the hum. They had taken my garden with rules. They had no idea what they had just started. I tried. I really did. After they razed my garden to dust, after the last petal was carried away in a trash bag, I stared at the empty yard and thought, maybe they're right. Maybe this is how things are supposed to be. So I went to the hardware store, the one with the perfectly paved parking lot and the rows of obedient plants in black plastic pots. I bought the regulation grass seed, the kind they recommended, the kind that promised uniform green with little effort. I bought 3 rose bushes, soft pink, and approved by the city's plant list. I bought edging stones to define my flower beds into proper rectangles, and a bag of white mulch that looked sterile as snow. It was the first time I'd ever gardened without joy. I followed the manual like scripture, measured the height of my lawn with a ruler, trimmed the grass every 3rd day, even swept the sidewalk afterward in case a single blade dared cross the line. I spaced the roses exactly 12 feet apart. I watered at sunrise to minimize evaporation, just like the brochure said. It was all so clean, so controlled, so absolutely lifeless. Weeks passed. The grass grew like a mat, green and obedient, offering no surprise. The roses bloomed exactly once, then stood still, pruned into stiff, proper shapes. There were no bees, not one. No butterflies drifted by, no ladybugs. The lavender-scented air that used to carry the quiet hum of life now hung still, blank. It was like walking into a painting of a garden, not a real one. The kind of painting you'd find in a waiting room. Pleasant, inoffensive, easy to forget. Neighbors complimented me now. "Looks so neat," one said, waving as she jogged by. "Glad they got things sorted." I smiled and said, "Thank you." Then I went inside and stood in my kitchen with the windows open, hoping for the sound of wings. I would have settled for a wasp even, but nothing came. The 5-year-old girl stopped coming too. She used to bring me dandelion crowns and ask me what each plant was called. Now she rode her scooter past the house without a glance, off to find a new patch of color. At night, I dreamed of roots. Long-reaching, tangled roots that cracked sidewalks and grew through walls, bursting into rooms filled with ash. I'd wake, up sweating, heart thumping with something I couldn't name. I started walking, just to move, to think. And on one of those walks, I found a patch of clover growing near the edge of a dried-out ditch. It wasn't supposed to be there. It was messy and too tall, the purple heads bobbing like tiny rebellions in the breeze. I crouched down and saw bees. Not many, just 2, maybe 3. But they were there. I didn't mean to reach for them. It was instinct, like greeting old friends. They buzzed around my fingers, then drifted back to the flowers. That night, I opened the drawer where I had hidden my seed packets. They were supposed to be thrown out. Too many of them were technically invasive or unregulated by the city's list. But I couldn't bring myself to toss them. Poppies, cornflowers, black-eyed Susans, sweet alyssum, cosmos, wild lupine. I laid them out on the kitchen table like cards from a forgotten deck. I stared at them, heart thudding with something dangerous. The next day, I wore an old jacket and filled the pockets with seeds. Just a few at first. I took them on my walks, my feet following instinct more than direction. I found cracks in the sidewalk where rainwater collected. I found corners of forgotten land behind utility poles and vacant lots filled with broken glass, and I scattered, a handful here, a pinch there. I pressed seeds into the soil with my thumb. No one noticed. No one asked. People rarely pay attention to things that don't make noise. The thing about wildflowers is, they know how to wait, and then they know how to bloom. The first one appeared a month later, near the storm drain across from the high school. A single orange California poppy, its petals curling like flames. I stopped and stared. No one else did. The next week, a patch of bachelor's buttons rose up near the bike rack at the community center. Then golden coreopsis by the edge of the parking lot. Someone must have seen them, but no one said anything. They weren't mine, not exactly. But I knew their names. I knew how they grew, how they fought for space in the hardened ground, how they caught the light, like they remembered something ancient. The bees returned first. I saw them sipping from a stand of lavender I had planted behind the grocery store's dumpster. Then came the dragonflies, iridescent and strange. Then birds, bright ones. Birds I hadn't seen in years. People started to notice. A few kids bent down to look. Some teens took pictures and posted them. I saw a spray-painted sidewalk captioned, "Flower Bomb." I kept planting. I became quieter, more precise. I learned which seeds liked the sun, which liked the shade under rusted fences. I began to understand. The language of overlooked places, the way abandoned corners spoke of potential. I never said a word to anyone. I didn't need to. But I could feel something beginning, not just in the dirt, not just in the flowers or the air, but in me. I had tried to follow their rules. I had played their game, trimmed my life into straight lines and tight corners. But I wasn't meant for edges. I wasn't built to be tidy. The wildness had only been sleeping. Now, it was waking up. The wildflowers began to multiply. Slowly at first, like secrets whispered from root to root, but then they surged, as if they had been waiting for someone to set them free. The corners of the city changed. What had once been blank spaces, gravel lots, road medians, neglected, ditches, started to hum with color. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a few blooms, scattered like shy confetti. But they caught the eye. A cluster of scarlet poppies beside a traffic light, a splash of blue cornflowers rising defiantly from a storm drain, yellow daisies dotting the edge of a cracked sidewalk like they belonged there. People began to notice. Not everyone, not right. Away, but enough. A woman walking her dog stopped to take a picture of a thick stand of cosmos outside the chain-link fence that bordered the water treatment plant. A group of children, loud and curious, paused in front of a burst of purple cone flowers, pushing through the gravel behind a gas station. Someone tied a ribbon around a tree trunk near a patch of blooming bee balm and stuck a handmade sign in the dirt. This place is magic. I never signed my work. I never claimed a single patch. That wasn't the point. These flowers weren't mine. They were for everyone and no one. A gift, unwrapped in silence. But I knew each bloom. I recognized their wild angled growth, the colors they gave the world without apology. I could spot the twist of petals I had sewn with shaking fingers, the lopsided joy of a sunflower that had sprouted in the most impossible place. They tried to fight back. The city workers, I mean. They mowed down the flowers along the fence behind. City Hall. Called it a safety issue. They posted signs that warned of unauthorized planting. One morning, they ripped out an entire stretch of blooming black-eyed Susans from the median on Pine Street and replaced them with gravel. But I was faster. Every time they erased one, two more took its place. I had found allies, people I didn't even know, planting their own seeds in their own quiet ways. An old man down the block who started growing sunflowers along the railway fence. A teenager who left morning glories to climb the electrical poles. Even the 5-year-old girl returned, sneaking marigold seeds into the planter boxes outside the library. It was spreading, not just the flowers, the defiance. You could feel it, like something loosening in the chest of the city. People started talking more. Neighbors who'd once nodded politely now stood in clusters, pointing at the colors. There were questions. Did you plant that? What is that one called? How did it grow here? And under each question, a quiet admiration, a glimmer of hope that something real could still break through the concrete. One morning, I turned the corner by the overpass and stopped in my tracks. Someone, maybe one of my silent co-conspirators, had transformed the underside of the bridge. What had once been graffiti-stained gray was now bordered by bursts of wild phlox and sunlit marigolds. Vines curled up the metal beams, daring to soften the steel, and hanging from one of the poles, made from twine and wood scraps, was a sign. Let the wild things bloom. I laughed, loud, free. This was no longer just my rebellion. It had grown into something else entirely, something collective, something sacred. Of course, not everyone was happy. Some of the neighbors muttered about property values. They called it weedy, said it looked abandoned, like a symptom of decay. I knew that language. I'd heard it before. Words like messy, uncontrolled, invasive. But what they saw as chaos, we saw as life returning. I began to walk the city with pockets always full. My hands were calloused from scattering seeds, my shoes stained with soil. I carried a spoon for digging into dry dirt, and a tiny watering can in my backpack for patches that needed help. I worked at dusk, or dawn, or in the soft hours when people weren't paying attention. And I kept listening, to the bird song growing louder each morning, to the laughter of children counting petals, to the bees that had finally come back, not just a few, but clouds of them, dancing drunkenly through goldenrod and yarrow. I watched a woman kneel beside a burst of lavender outside a bus stop and cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. The wildflowers had become a language, a reminder, a resistance. One afternoon, walking by the school, I saw a boy with a handful of seeds standing beside the chain-link fence. He looked around, like he wasn't sure he should be doing what he was doing. I caught his eye. I didn't say a word. I just smiled. He smiled back and let the seeds go. That night I sat on my porch, the breeze warm on my skin, and listened to the sound of wings fluttering through the dusk. A goldfinch darted past, and in the distance I could just make out the high, familiar hum of bees. This was no longer a fight. It was a movement. The wildflowers didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for a permit or a plan. They grew because they could, because they must. Every sidewalk crack was a canvas, every overlooked lot a revolution. What had started with a handful of stolen seeds had become a quiet uprising, a living protest. And I understood now that they could mow it down 100 times. They could post their signs and enforce their codes. But they couldn't stop the sky from opening to color. They couldn't stop the earth from remembering, and they couldn't stop us from planting again. Summer came, and the city bloomed like a secret finally spoken aloud. It wasn't just the flowers anymore. It was how people began to walk differently, eyes up, scanning walls and sidewalks not for hazards, but for beauty. Strangers started leaving things behind, hand-painted rocks tucked near clusters of daisies, tiny poems scrawled on bits of paper, stuck in fences, wind chimes made from bottle caps and copper wire dancing in the warm breeze. I started to see less shame and more pride. Little kids wore wildflower crowns made of weeds and clovers. Elderly women picked bunches of goldenrod and tied them with string to leave on park benches. There were conversations happening, quiet ones, spontaneous, full of wonder. People spoke to each other about roots and soil and sky. And then someone, I never knew who, painted a mural. It was huge, 4 stories tall, on the side of an old warehouse near the edge of the river district. It showed a woman's face, eyes closed, hair made of vines and blossoms, monarchs escaping from her open mouth. In bold letters, across the bottom it said, "They took the garden with rules. We took back the sky with wildflowers." I stood in front of it for hours, stunned. Those were my words. I hadn't written them anywhere. I'd only ever said them aloud once to myself in the dark after they took my garden. Somehow they'd traveled, like pollen on the wind, found ears, found hands, found paint. I wanted to cry. But instead, I laughed, loud, free. And then I walked home barefoot, the sidewalk warm beneath my feet. The city officials responded exactly as I expected. They issued statements about unauthorized murals, public safety, and the importance of controlled landscaping. They posted notices and held meetings. They started sending crews out again, weed whackers and mowers and grim-faced men in city vests. But it was too late. For every patch they cut down, 5 more sprang up. They were relentless. The seeds had been sown not just into soil, but into memory, into the cracks of people's lives. And people had begun to remember something important, that they belonged to the earth, not the other way around. It wasn't perfect. Some areas were trampled, some flowers didn't make it, some residents were angry, tired of what they called the mess. But others pushed back. I saw a teenage girl arguing with a city worker about the right of milkweed to grow in front of the community center. I saw a man in a wheelchair tape a "Do Not Disturb" sign to a patch of bachelor's buttons in front of his apartment. I saw the 5-year-old girl again, now 6, leading a group of kids on a pollinator safari through a median filled with goldenrod and echinacea. It was working. Something in the air had shifted. And then, on a morning heavy, with sun and bee song, I got a letter, not from the city, from a woman named Joanna. She lived 3 towns over. She had heard about the mural. She had found a bag of wildflower seeds taped to a park bench with a note. "Plant me wherever you want the world to breathe again." She wanted to know if I was the one who started it. I didn't know how to answer. Not exactly. It had grown far beyond me. Still, I wrote her back. I told her about the first seeds, the corner of the ditch near the clover, the silence after my garden was taken. I told her I had been angry, yes, but mostly I had been heartbroken. That planting had been my way of refusing despair. She replied a week later. She'd started planting on the banks of a dried-up creek near her town. Already the bees had come. Already the city had sent her a warning notice. "I'm going to keep planting," she wrote. "They can't arrest the flowers." I pinned her letter to my fridge. More came after that, from people I'd never met. Letters, drawings, seed packets, pressed blooms between folded paper. A woman in Arizona who turned an abandoned highway shoulder into a trail of poppies. A couple in Chicago who planted native grasses in sidewalk cracks. A group of school kids in Montreal who covered an entire hill with sunflowers for the bees. It was everywhere now. Not a trend, not a protest, a return. The world, after all, wants to grow. You don't need to tell the earth how to be beautiful. You just have to stop telling it no. The city tried again. New ordinances, stricter landscaping, codes. But even their own workers started letting certain patches live. Maintenance oversight, they said. But I knew better. I saw the way one of them bent down once to photograph a patch of fireweed blooming against a concrete wall. His face softened. He smiled. They couldn't stop it. The wildflowers had taken hold, not just in dirt and gravel, but in minds, in hearts, in muscle memory. The people remembered, the earth remembered, and I, for the first time in years, planted in my own yard again, not in defiance this time, but in celebration. I didn't ask. I didn't apologize. I dug my hands into the soil and sowed every inch with color. Milkweed, rudbeckia, bee balm, liatris. A riot of species, native, forgotten, stubborn, and the bees came back, and the birds, and the laughter of children. The wind carried the scent of lavender and thyme. My porch is now a place where people stop, sit, share stories. Someone leaves little paintings of the flowers each week. Someone else sings softly while sketching the view. I tend the garden each morning, still barefoot, still whispering to the roots. But I no longer feel alone, because the sky is full now of color, of wings, of life we once thought lost. They took my garden with rules. I took back the sky with wildflowers, and now so have we all.